We can talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Well, let me see. The one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently, I don't know how much of a historian of Christianity you are. I'm going to assume you definitely know a lot more than me. But one thing I've been looking into a lot is recently is classical education. So that was the way that the Greeks and the Romans would have developed character. And I haven't got a chance to look into how Christians did that or what their take on that was. In terms of the way the Christians held together Europe as an educational institute. Like when Rome fell, and it was all just went back to essentially farming culture. They set up the universities. Here in Ireland, actually, it was apparently a bastion of civilization, which I'm not surprised, to be honest.
There are quite a few books about how the Irish saved civilization.
I think that's it. Now I've seen books like that. I've also seen books saying that Ireland was the original Jerusalem and Ireland was the original Atlantis, and I like those books as well. I think they're very factual. I think we can just keep dogpiling on the truth here, and then we'll just start to figure it out. We'll be like, all right, Jesus was an Irishman, and I've heard stories as well. I've heard people say that he went to England and when he was younger, and he went to Stonehenge. I've also heard people say Jesus went to India as well. So
and America, so say the Mormons. So and people have Jesus going everywhere.
He must have been well traveled. God, if he didn't have an Instagram account, or you imagine the followers he'd have.
That's right. Well, the question about formation, though, is very interesting, and it's part of what is so difficult about these questions is that there's been so much. And if you look at, one way to form Christians, there have been so many different ways. I've just been, I read Tom Holland's Dominion a couple of months ago, and right now making my way through The Shadow of the Sword. And, I like Tom's books because they're fun to read, and they'll give you a nice, quick overview of history in a very, you guys would really enjoy it on your channel because he's not quite as extreme as you guys, but he's fairly cheeky, and he just kind of blows through history quickly, but can give you a lot of places that you can dip in deeper. So, a lot of what dominated, there are these periods where Christianity looked very different from what it looked in earlier times. For example, obviously with Constantine and that revolution, the mode of the Christian church had to change quite significantly from being a sporadically persecuted insurgent religion in the Roman Empire to the religion of the empire. Obviously with the fall, with the collapse, and it's helpful to remember the collapse of the Western Empire comes early and is far different from the history of the Eastern Empire. So really monasticism sort of saves Christianity. Christianity sort of replaces the empire, because with the Germanic tribes coming over, everything seems to sort of fall apart, and the church is the one institution standing. And so you have these monastic movements that have monastic orders where you basically submit yourself to the rule of the religious order, the rule of the abbot or whoever is leading your order, and that then becomes formation. This changes radically in the Protestant Reformation. Of course, Ireland has been, one of the most, I really have to avail myself of these How Ireland Saved Christianity books, because there are a number of them out there, and they're very credible books. But
of course.
It's true. But the story is so insanely complex.
Yes.
And by the time you get to the late Renaissance, early Reformation, Erasmus reclassifies, makes Western education classical again. And that mode of classical education held sway to the beginning of the 20th century and the rise of the pragmatists. And we're still sort of in the era of pragmatism in terms of education.
That would be like William James and whatnot.
Yeah. William James, Dewey, they radically redid education for the industrial age. And then you had others like Rudolf Steiner that pushed back on that. But, really everybody anybody who was very well educated until the early to mid 20th century was educated in the way that basically Erasmus of Rotterdam, held, in terms of, you read the Greeks, you read the Romans, you learn Latin, you learn Greek, and you steep yourself in that classical tradition. And that classical tradition sort of was Christianized by church fathers, and so the education that, say, the likes of someone like C.S. Lewis received was very much still that sort of Erasmian education. So there have been many, many different ways of conceiving what a Christian education should be and what Christian formation should be. And if you grew up in the church in Ireland, you received probably, did you grow up going to church?
Yeah, well, it wouldn't go weekly, but I remember there's points I remember going weekly, but generally we'd go like main holidays and whatnot. So we weren't that pious.
And the mass was it wasn't in Latin.
Parts of it were, I think, but it wasn't a Latin mass. I remember some Latin bopping out. Like I kind of recognized the tones and the sounds, and I've been recently looking into Latin a lot more, and I'm like, oh god, this is actually like vaguely familiar, and I kind of get why. But I'm pretty sure they spoke English for some of it, or most of it. Sorry.
Did you go to any kind of catechism class when you were young?
Not that I can think of now. Not that I can think of. No, like the integration between the church and the schooling and education was like in school, in first class, you'd have religious studies. What was it called? It was called Boyo, which is Irish for alive, I think. And it was a book. It was a white book. I remember it. And I was hearing about all the stories of Moses and all that. And I remember hearing them through there. And then you get your communion, for example. So it was very, very Catholic. You get your communion, and around about, I think it was 11 or 12, you'd literally go during school time to the church, and they teach you how to take communion, and then you'd all show up for communion and whatnot. Confirmation was another big one. And so there's an integration. You'd say your prayers. I remember saying prayers. I think it was only when the priest came in, though. But I remember saying prayers. I think the teacher skipped it until the priest showed up. When the priest showed up, you'd do something like the rosary. Like I remember doing all the things like the rosary and that was intense stuff. And I remember my grandfather doing it with me as well. But it was not that consistent, It wasn't like a lifestyle thing anymore. It was sort of like it would flicker in and out as a relic of the past, and something that was kind of interesting and cool. But I just don't really remember it being a prominent thing at all.
See, and in Ireland, I would imagine you all were sort of there at the end of the twilight of that, because those who were raised in England, probably a generation before you, they would have had, again, certain degree of Christian education in school, or religious education in school. In the United States, that's radically different because of the separation of church and state. But still, in the beginning of the 20th century, there still was, if the culture was Christian, there'd be prayer in public school, and some of that became a fight in the 70s in the United States. So, over the, throughout the end of the second half of the 20th century, there was a rather radical de-Christianizing of public institutions in the United States in terms of these formal areas. But again, a lot of it in Protestantism, some Protestants, like, let's say, the Dutch Reformed, had sort of you had catechism in your youth, but most of the catechesis, which would be the Christian formation, would happen as sort of a classroom setting. And then in our tradition, you would have what was called profession of faith, which would be analogous to your first communion. Here comes Kevin.
Keep
And
going,
so
keep going.
you had all of those traditions. Now, a Pentecostal like Kevin, that he would have Royal Rangers and all kinds of other things. So you just, it's continued to evolve, and with the secularization of the countries in the West, a lot of it sort of stripped out. And I think in Ireland, probably sort of at the far end of things. So
yeah, well, I remember in secondary school, for example, we did religious studies, and the teacher was a Protestant as well, and I was actually a Catholic in a Protestant school, so that was very, very interesting. That was the dynamic flipped. Like most of the rest of the country was the opposite way around, you know. And she was teaching us religious studies, I remember, and we had the book, and one part of the book was like Buddhism. And that was like, I could kind of tell that was something weird and new and different. And the way now what I know about Buddhism, I kind of realized that it was presented in sort of the new agey Buddhism thing as well. And so I know what you're saying, that the secularism was beginning to creep in a little bit, and it was getting to phase out. But actually, when I was in school, we went to church every Sunday. I remember that. And there was the headmasters was like very pious people. And I guess in order to, so we can link into what Kev wanted to talk about as well, this actually gives us a good link. So the reason why I brought this up, and the reason why I was thinking about this, was I was looking at the theory of man, or the theory of human nature, inherent in each of these, I guess you could call, paradigms that are dominant throughout the world. Like you would have Nietzsche observed that the ancient past had a theory of man that was, you know, like Achilles. And then Christianity comes along with its theory of man based on the premise of original sin. So I guess the original sin for the ancient warrior was, if you're weak, you're sinful. If you're strong, you're good. And then the Christian sin was, you've got that original sin, which I guess is by nature of you being a fallen being. Like evil and suffering exist in the world because it's you, and it comes out of you. And if you want to stop it, you have to internalize your focus and try to correct that. And so that's an educational thesis, you know. That's the way I'd see that. The same as I'd see sort of with the Romans and the Greeks. And then the Enlightenment comes along and it says, you are empty, you are blank. And the only reason there's suffering and evil in the world is because of the oppression of the Catholic Church programming you, because you're like this empty computer. And so the Catholic Church comes along and says, be ashamed, be ashamed, and be crooked and corrupt and all this stuff. And then what would happen is, well, the theory is, what would happen is people would go into this church and come out, and they'd come out brainwashed. And then the Enlightenment people like Rousseau was like, we just need to get back to our nature. And I kind of get where they're coming from. You look at a kid, and the kid's walking around, the kid's like very imaginative and quite naturally happy. And so they're probably like, well, that's what all people are like naturally, although they've probably never met someone like Karl Panzram or a serial killer. But it is wrapped up in that idea. And so the Enlightenment idea set that premise for, we're all computers that need to be coded. And that actually set the premise for a lot of what we see as modern education. Like modern education is very focused on character, and as a consequence, even stuff like religion, which like religious teaching would be character development. Like the Catholic original sin idea, I should say Christian original sin idea, has a lot of beef in it, because you kind of see Jordan Peterson pushing back on that, being like, it's worth developing someone's character for no other reason apart from developing their character, because it solves problems in the world that you can't predict. It's just a good thing to do. And that thesis relies on this idea that you have a nature that needs to be sort of tweaked or worked with. But the Enlightenment comes with this idea that you're a naturally rational being, and you just need to be programmed properly. Right. And that's where the whole information state comes in, where it's like, all right, take them in, and then give them the books, feed the books, and then they'll come out and they'll be good. And it's, well, I don't know, has that thesis worked out, which is an interesting thing. So that's where it was coming from. And well, maybe later I'll be able to paint why I think that relates to what we wanted to talk about with Kevin. But
are you guys hearing me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I didn't want to interrupt any of that when I opened up the link. I was just like, oh, they're already talking.
Yes, we're already recording as well, man. So
yeah.
Well, and I just wanted to add, you know, I think part of the significance of Peterson in this has been I think you're right that via the Enlightenment, a lot of people saw us as these blank slates, and Peterson, in a sense, came along and said, "No, we're already deeply programmed." But that conversation about character and what became, at least in the United States, secular education, that's been going on for quite a while, because the assumption, part of what happened in the modernist fundamentalist fight in the beginning of the late 19th, early 20th century is that they basically said, okay, we'll use the world and science to figure out what is, but human, in terms of how humans should behave, we'll get that from the Bible. And so, for example, in the United States, that pretty much held sway until really the end of the Cold War, when the United States sort of flipped, because we used to be fighting godless communism, and it sort of flipped and said, well, now we have to fight fundamentalist Islam. So now suddenly religion is suspect. You see this huge rise in the people who are unaffiliated with religion. And so
very interesting. God, I never thought of it like that. That's a very interesting take. And so once it moved away from godless communists to Islam, religion, and so that's where you get Sam Harris and all that calling out the Muslims as against Ben Affleck and all that.
He conflates all religion with the evils that were done on 9/11.
That's interesting, because like that's a lot of weight to put on, for example, the political situation. Like, does the political situation drive the collective thinking that much, or would you say there was a broader trend in place where this was on its way regardless?
Well, so if you look at the United States in the 50s and 60s, you had this, and before it, you had this assumption that the Bible was a morally reliable book. The 60s counterculture begins to flip that over. And that changes slowly, and it isn't really until the 90s when you begin to see, and especially the rise of new atheism after 9/11, where they begin to say the Bible is immoral, that this God that we find in the Bible is immoral. Before, the Bible was moral, but prudish, maybe unrealistic. Afterwards, now the Bible is immoral, because the Bible should have been, the Bible should have had a rule against slavery. The Bible should have been much more in favor of women. The Bible shouldn't talk about gays like it does. And so what happens, at least in the United States, is that there's a flip between, and that happens slowly, because of course, what you had in American culture, you had the moral majority in the 80s, where evangelicals sort of try to go back to the mainline stances of protecting the Bible, so on and so forth. So that's a very long and complex thing, and these things work slowly through the culture. So again, after 2000, it's pretty much fully baked that people are taking moral stances against the Bible, and church people aren't just uptight or prudish, but they're actually immoral. Well, that's the big flip that happened after 2000.
That's interesting, because I do know the YouTube culture, when it first started, was like you'd have like a load of atheists come on. Yeah. And the whole thing was like, oh, calling out Christianity and all this. And like, look at the way things are now, where like the big thing is as you're saying, Jordan Peterson and all that. So
that's how Sargon started, is calling out Christians.
Really?
Stop.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he and a lot of the crowd that he used to be in, a lot of those people have completely fallen off the map ever since Jordan Peterson showed up and started to put a lot more value into Christianity as far as what people would see on YouTube. And then suddenly people are like, wait, we can't attack this way anymore, because it's getting rid of our foundation. So when Sargon started up on talking about some of the values in Christianity, that's, a lot of people started going, wait a second, you're supposed to be against this stuff. And so you start getting this switch, this schism in the atheist camps between anti-theists and just atheists that understand their culture.
Well, I think the woke movement really fractured the Church of New Atheism, because and Peterson fits right in there, because what happened was, so you had atheism, and yeah, the Bible is immoral, we have to get rid of religion and Christianity because it's immoral. And then Atheism Plus comes along and says, oh, but we need atheism plus, this social justice ethos. And that then, of course, splits the church, because then suddenly you've got Sam Harris, Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay. You've got all these on the sort of the anti-woke tribe saying, hey, wait a minute, we're classical liberals. We believe in, science and all of this. And the woke crew just keeps going away with, oh, people are fully formed. They're, in some ways, they're also heirs of the Enlightenment, where people are blank slates, and it's up to us to reprogram them. But then the question is always, well, who programmed you? I mean, because you can't find a human being with that model that hasn't been programmed by someone. So there is no pure human being. But they say, no, morality is self-evident. And so here's morality. Then you got a guy like Tom Holland comes along and says, yeah, but this morality of the woke, that's just repackaged Christianity. And of course, then the woke people are, but they're also split, because you have sort of the Christian woke tribe and the atheist woke tribe. And now you have the Christian modernists aligned now with their old enemies, the old anti-theists, who now being terrified because their church has been taken over by the University of Woke, now are, running for cover and meeting with Christians. So it's crazy.
This is like listening to the evolution of a music genre or something like that. It just keeps on like splitting out. Classic rock, hard rock, metal, it's all got the same source. It is actually a good point. Like, this is something I came across in Nietzsche, his like the whole death of God thing, like, very famous thing. Obviously like massively misunderstood. Like, one thing that he was always saying is that what will happen is, with the whole lack of God thing, what will happen is we'll pull out the metaphysic, we'll pull out the sort of the big theory, but what will remain is the assertions. You can in some sense say the instincts have been built into us at this point, the Christian instincts, and the sort of God that moderated them, if you will, or gave them a coherent sense. If you pull that out, what you get is you get a load of people who are like anti-God, but completely, even like radically Christian in a way. Like, they abstract the ideals and take them to these like radical conclusions. And that's something that I've noticed. I've been like learning a new way of looking at this recently, and it's almost like Christianity and atheism as we understand it now is because I think you met Neil, and Neil would strike me as someone who's like pretty much a real Christian. Like, I'm like, Jesus Christ, the metaphor, and he's like, it's not a metaphor, bro. And I'm like, whoa.
Well, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And that's kind of like, and then you're talking to the people who are like cultural Christians and all that, and then you have the atheists, and they're like trapped in the paradigm, because they're all trying to share the same values, but they're trying to argue over something. But it's like the paradigm is stuck, and it's so deep, or maybe so high, that they can't quite see it or change it. And that's really dictating quite a lot of stuff. So as you're saying, they're attacking each other and eating at each other. And it's weird, because it's like they're fighting over their own version of a similar enough ideology in some sense.
It's also a social power thing, because if they claim, if we say, hey, we're cultural Christians, but if we put too much faith in Christianity, this coming from an atheist, if we put too much faith in Christianity, we might end up being cast out as, oh, they're Christians now, so they're not on our social level anymore. And so it's kind of the awkward situation where Job is, where he's like, I'm right on the edge here. I still can't get to Jesus yet, but there's something here, and I can't say I'm an atheist.
Yeah, I think Job's gone a little further than that now, but
where is he now?
That's a process. Well, he fully joined his church,
mm-hmm.
and he does a podcast now with his pastor. So
Yeah, I spoke with him the other day. We did his podcast for the Discord.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And we had a long conversation about Pentecostalism.
Well, Pentecostals are interesting because, you know, I think you're right, Steafon, with the Nietzschean paradigm that, you know, remove the metaphysics, but the habits and the moral impulses lag. And of course, Nietzsche says, well, you're gonna have to clean all that stuff out. But people are like, no, we don't have to clean that out. That's who we are. That's what's right and wrong. Pentecostals sort of double down on the metaphysic and say, oh, really? God is no longer here? You know, watch me speak in tongues. Watch us do healings in church. Watch us do deliverance. We're gonna cast out demons right in front of the church. And they basically just thumb their nose at modernity and say, you know, you never had it right. We're not believing you for a minute. We're doubling down on what we read in the Bible. I don't care what you say.
The book of Acts. That's where you'll see the majority of what we put weight into. And Job and I were talking about, it's like, this stuff sounds so weird. And I said, it's completely normal for people to be freaked out by a Pentecostal church. So, or you were wagging your fingers, Steafon.
I was about to go on a tear about the devil. So I don't know if he's ready for that. But if you don't mind me,
well, he's who I wanted to talk about with this conversation.
Well, yeah. Shall we get into Diablos a bit? Let me see. Make sure the mic is facing me here.
Yeah, your mic is a little. I don't know if it's clipping or what. I'm not quite sure what's happening with your mic.
Give us 1 second before we talk to the devil.
Before you take a tear in with the. I don't know if it's your mic or the internet. I don't know what it is, but you've got some.
How's it now, sir?
That's
better.
Good.
That's fantastic. So magic. I just said. I just prayed to Richard Dawkins and he fixed it all.
Oh, this is going to be interesting.
Air
away. Let's hear it.
Well, okay. So the thing you brought up with the Pentecostals was interesting because they propose. Well, okay. So first of all, you were saying that we keep the habits and this is right and wrong. And baked into that is a thesis. This is, I guess, a human psychological universal. You're always proposing a theory of evil. You're always saying there is something that is evil. That is wrong, that is bad. There is always a good. So this is the sort of idea of the archetype. There is always the archetype of evil and the archetype of good. Now, maybe what you fill that with changes, and that would be sort of like Nietzsche being like, it's a little bit relative, but the archetype is real. And that's actually a pretty interesting idea in and of itself. Like it's the shape is correct. And so what you get with, for example, a modern woke liberal or whatever, or even a modern woke liberal atheist or Christian, is that they will have that evil archetype, and they might even have different names for it, but it's generally pointed towards similar things, intolerance, and whatever they've conceptualized as the cultural paradigm, if you will. And so this becomes a very, very fascinating issue because you will get someone like the Pentecostals in the same culture, like the same nation, and they will have a thesis of evil. And I think if you dug down to it, they would actually push it nearly on something like technology or modernity. Now, these are two sets of Christians, but their thesis of evil would be very, very close. Like even, I think they're called the Amish as well. Like their thesis of evil would be
very different from the Pentecostals.
Very different.
Apologies, but you know the way they would have a thesis of evil that might be pushed towards the idea of progress. Like progress is a bit of a lie, or a delusion. I don't know, am I getting this perfect? But I know the way they hold back. They're very
just keep tearing, and we'll sort it out.
Yeah,
sweet. So like they would have a radically suspicious attitude towards progress, whereas if you talk to any modern person in Silicon Valley, they would deify progress as almost good, and not progressing as they'd look at an Amish person and be like, you're evil. And it's weird to describe, but they project the archetype. They'd feel that anger towards them, being like, you're holding us back. You actually see this a lot in American culture now, where there's this anger towards those who are holding us back. And then there's, on the other side, anger towards those who are trying to revolve society into something radically new that we haven't agreed upon and all this. And the thesis of evil is shifting around and whatnot. And it became very interesting to look at when this conception of Lucifer and Satan and what evil is, because evil has always been painted as Satan. He began thousands of years ago as the adversary, as the thing Christ said, get behind me, go away, F off, like that type of thing. It was like literally, please go away. And in some sense, that's a universal description of, you know, temptation and your impulses and all that. But it began, the word Satan begins as the word adversary. Over the course of 1,000 years, highly Christian society, it becomes whatever it's going to become. But the most fascinating part for me, and this kind of relates to the stuff that me and Jimmy were doing when we were talking about Ion, is around about the 15th century, Renaissance, the Enlightenment, we'll say the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, modernity, the idea of progress. That's also the radical de-Christianization of the West. That's around about the time you get this conception of Satan moving sort of towards this idea of profound arrogance that you see in Paradise Lost. The idea of everything's unified in God's united plan, and then Lucifer is the most excellent and beautiful singer in the choir, and he is so good, and God has made him this way on purpose, and he is so good he actually gets a notion that he could probably do a better job on his own, and he doesn't like taking orders, and so he jumps down and tries to set his own plan, to create his own plan, to create his own world. And that's happening in England. Like John Milton wrote this when the Parliament was getting established, when they're having that war for the breakaway from the crown. So we're starting to see this whole idea of the old, deep, divinely inspired Catholic order moving on to this new revolutionary order, which is picking up these ideas that every single person is valuable. The whole aristocracy did not see, they saw a caste system that was the same as anything in India. In that sense, you had peasants, you had kings, like there was a distinction, and that was enforced by God, which was Christian. And then now these guys are now moving, like Luther comes up around this time as well. They're moving towards this idea that everybody has that divine soul. It's clearly in the Bible, like read it, don't let your priest tell you what to read. That's coming up at the same time as the Enlightenment, where everybody's breaking away into this, I guess you could say this, they're breaking away into this new paradigm. And this new paradigm seems to be, this is going to sound like, this is some conspiracy theory, but this whole paradigm seems to be the one we're in right now. Napoleon comes after that. That's the ultimate symbol of destroy the church, establish a new liberal nationalism order. The same with communism. That's like the next step, completely destroy Christianity altogether. And it's on the same principle. Everybody is equal. Their souls are all equal. And it's around about that same idea. You're getting this idea of the fall out of heaven, the rebel against the old order. And this idea that we can all be free, we can all do our own thing, we can all establish our own reality, we can all become who we want to be. And in some sense, you're looking at these guys in Silicon Valley who are talking about like uploading their consciousness into machines so that they can like experience never-ending like ice creams getting shoved down their gullet, digital gullet or whatever. Like that's that same thing. It's like, who are you backwards Amish man, to tell me that I can't do that? That's my divine right. It's my divine right to get like 1 billion years of ice cream down my digital gullet. That's my right, because I am special, because I exist and all that. And as insane as it sounds, as insane as it sounds, the root of that idea, as I see it, seems to start to happen, all right, in the kind of mythic consciousness at that point of the fall of Lucifer in Paradise Lost. That's around about that time there was a big shift in the culture. And it seems like something radically new was happening at that point that set us up for something. And like, I'm not trying to say it like as the way it might sound. I'm suggesting that like Satan sort of rules the last 500 years or something like that. But there's something quite interesting about that I don't quite know what to make of. It explains a lot in this way of thinking, I guess, if you will. So whatever your thoughts are on that, there's my tear.
You want to go first, Kevin?
Well, one of the first things that I want to say is there was a movement. I can't remember if it was in England or if it was here, called the Luddites. They physically attacked machinery.
Yeah.
They came into textiles with sledgehammers and just tore the place apart, because they were exactly how you had described the Amish. They were against the idea of letting this technology take away the agency of a person. So where you had all of these people who would normally be working to spin thread and do all this stuff, and now they've been replaced by this machine. So it feels like an encroachment, where the Amish, my mother reads a whole bunch of Amish romances. I don't know why, but she got into that, and it's a very interesting culture just to read about. But the idea of technology being evil is not new. But when you were talking in that particular video of Satan saying, like, I'm gonna use thought and reason and progress against you. I was like, okay, I can understand where you're coming from with that, because there is a bit of a Luddite idea in Christian faith where it's just like, hey, this technology is gonna lead somewhere bad. But I also kind of look at it the same way that you would look at a knife. It's like, yeah, you can cook with it or you can kill with it. So I wouldn't necessarily look at technology as inherently evil, but it can be used that way. What? Go ahead, Paul.
There's so much here.
Yeah.
I'll start with Silicon Valley.
Yes, fantastic.
So one of the most popular educational models currently in Silicon Valley, which is not very far from where I live, is the Waldorf method, which was developed by a guy named Rudolf Steiner, who was kind of a German spiritualist who had very anti-technology ideas. And so many of the chieftains of Silicon Valley keep iPads and smartphones away from their children. So there's a little Amish in them too. The Amish were a breakaway group of Mennonites, which were part of the Radical Reformation. Now, there's so much going on here, and then I'll get to Satan in a minute. There's so much going on here that it's the challenge is to try to find commonalities that hold between them. And I would say the commonality that could hold together the Pentecostals, the Amish, and Silicon Valley would be the idea of a pristine state, a corrupted state, and the attempt to get back to that pristine state. We see that commonly in our culture now with the move towards natural products, organic food, paleo diet. Now, this impulse, I'd say that's a psychological impulse. That impulse was very strong in a whole host of Christian reform movements throughout the history of the Christian church. You'll find it in St. Francis of Assisi. If you read Tom Holland's Dominion, you'll find it again and again and again. People at many different points in time say, the church has lost its way. How can we get back to the original purity of the church? The Amish are an expression of that. Almost every reformational group is an expression of that. And there are many groups within the Catholic Church that were also expressions of that. One of the most famous, St. Francis of Assisi. But what's interesting with each of these groups that want to get back to purity after corruption, there's always an element of their present culture. They can't see the imagined ideal state without seeing it through the eyes of their present culture. And now this is very deep within Pentecostalism, because as Kevin said, Pentecostals said, we want to get back to the Church of Acts. Willow Creek Seeker movement said, we want to get back to the Church of Acts. You see this in Protestants all the time, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, sect after sect, group after group, want to get back to the book of Acts. And they tend to do so in a very formal sense, in that, well, if there's speaking in tongues there, we should have speaking in tongues now. If there's healing there, we should have healing now. And we're going to look at the language of the book of Acts and assimilate that. But what you see throughout church history is that every group that assimilates that has to do that within their own time frame and culture. And so even though all of those groups, in a sense, have the same project, they all manifest it in different ways because they're all approaching it from a different time. And so I think what we see in, and so there's this sense of this progressive vision that says, you know, the future is before us. We can, either through religious piety or intentional technology, we can build a better world. That idea comes from Christianity. This other impulse to go back to a pure time, that idea comes from Christianity. And these ideas can be found, I don't know if progressivism, you can find it in other places besides Christianity, but so there's a lot going on here, and you can see the different movements happen again and again. And so one layer of that might be psychological. Oh, we've lost our way. We have to get back to where we knew our way. I think that's you find human beings doing that. You find it in, you know, fundamentalist Islam, you know, going back to a previous prophet, going back. And so this impulse keeps happening. In Christianity, it keeps getting spun out in new reform movements, which we see again and again. So that's the one side. And then we can talk about Satan. So, because that's a whole nother thing.
Well, see, I kind of see a link. I'm not sure, it's very heretical the way I'll be presenting this, but I see a link between the impulse to constantly, because think of how Milton personified Satan. He was rebelling to create pandemonium. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. It's better to do it my way than bow and put my ability at the feet of a higher power. And so that's a very, very, very fascinating idea, because what you're describing is that sort of problem of, I guess you could say, the modern world. And it's like, it's kind of easy to point at the woke people, but you see it in Christianity as well. Like it's something that's super dominant. It's, I guess you could say, it's paradigmatic. It's a part of the paradigm. We keep fragmenting out into these little bubbles. And we're like, all right, this is the right way to do things. This is the right way to do things. And it becomes very, very interesting, because everybody then starts competing. And then what happens is you get someone like a communist who's like, well, this is the right way to do things. And they actually get power. And then it absolutely turns out to an absolute disaster. And it's a very, very interesting problem, because as you're describing, there is this, I guess we could say, an archetype they're all going after, the ideal state. And how do we critique this? What's going wrong here? Like, it seems psychologically what seems to be going wrong is the attitude. The idea is that what I can do is I can plan out the perfect state with maybe like a set of, I don't know, rules that I found at some reference point in either the Communist Manifesto or the Bible or something like that. And with those set of rules, all I have to do is get power and instantiate and code those rules in. And what will happen is the perfect state will just like literally drop out of the sky. What will happen is this giant stream of ice cream will go straight down my throat, and then that'll be everything sorted. But it's that type of thing. It's this some type of belief that I know what I'm doing, and I just need the power in order to instantiate that. And that is actually juxtaposed against the way I saw the Catholic Church running things and the way I see the ancient world running things, this is kind of difficult to understand, because it takes a different psychological way of understanding stuff. The way we understand laws is something that we write out in a logical way. I guess you could say in a left-brained way. We're like, oh, this is the set of laws, and we'll just make these laws, bake them into the cake, and boom, it will work, like ingredients. The Greeks would not let you recite laws unless you sang them. They had to be sung. All right. And that's a fascinating difference, because if you talk to a lawyer nowadays, like think of an ancient Irish druid. An ancient Irish druid would be a poet, a singer, a lawyer and a doctor combined into one. And so people would go to him and be like, what is the law? And he'd sing the song with the law in it. And it gets even weirder, man. The place where you store the words I'm speaking now, I store them in a certain part of my brain. The place where I store musical words, lyrics, I store in a different part of my brain. And so when you are singing the law, as opposed to saying the law, you're actually drawing it from a different part of your mind, which I don't know is that relevant, but it shows something. I don't know quite what it is, but it shows an interesting point. And the idea around here is that it's how do we say, creating a state is a lot more of an art project than something you're going to achieve when you code in the laws and then the state is finished. It's like a computer, coded, done, we're out of here, Paul, let's go to the ice cream parlor. Like, that's what we kind of think. It's like communism established, no more suffering, boom, job done. Whereas this older attitude seems to be more like this, we're playing some music. If you stop playing the violin, the music ends and Satan wins. It's that type of idea. It's like you're always doing it. The Catholics had sort of a similar idea, as far as I understand, in that they, like, that's sort of a little bit of their principle about taking the book away from people, is that, look, if you read this, you'll cause problems because this is a hard book to figure out, and I know a lot. And so they would sort of present it in this type of way. They did paganize it a little bit as well. You even see it over in Japan, the concept of the reason, the job of the king was to keep the society in harmony with the universe. And they start using these musical metaphors a lot more. And like, you can even look in ancient Icelandic, the word law and the word poem are like essentially related, I believe. You might have to check me up on that one. But it's this type of idea that I'm getting at, and it's like I guess my proposition in some sense is the Satan character, the evil character. If we're going to psychologize it, I know some people don't like this, but if we could psychologize it, it does seem to be related to around some type of arrogant need to firmly grip onto things and say, I've got the perfect law and solution, and I just need the power to instantiate it, instead of what seems to be the more ancient way that's counter to it, that's completely unconscious. Like, everybody's like, who's got the right way? And that's the fight. Who's got the right set of principles for the kingdom? And no one's maybe talking about like a whole new change of perspective, which is it something where we actually need to get a whole virtuous cycle going on where everybody's playing in symphony with the choir? I don't know, am I well understood there? But perhaps Satan is that arrogance to want to, that clutching anxiety to need those firm rules, as opposed to the more loose, shall we say, the more musical attitude towards it. So there's my thesis, I guess, in full.
Well, I think the arrogance would be accurate. That he's heavily associated with pride.
Yes.
Pride is why he was kicked out. And the thing that kept popping into my head while you were saying these things is, like, we're trying to automate things, and like it gets to a point. I think we've gotten to the point where we have automated physical things enough to the degree at which we're like, wait a second, we can't automate creativity or spiritual things. Like, you can't automate your spiritual life. It's like, oh, there's a wall there. And you made the analogy. It's like, what if hell is going to be this sphere up in space that everybody has uploaded their consciousness into, thinking that, oh, if we don't have our bodies anymore, we won't be tempted or corrupt anymore. And suddenly all of the bad characteristics of their mind are culminating in this sphere of thought, and all of the negativity compacts, and suddenly everything is hell. All of your experience is like hatred and anger and bitterness and resentment.
I kept trying to make that music analogy because you could think of it like we have the best violins, but no one can play. So what happens? We're just sort of like playing this shit.
Yeah.
Like that's the way I'd imagine it, and that's sort of what I'm getting at is that everyone's focused on what's the right sheet music, what's the right violin, what's the right dynamics, and it's like I know what the right dynamics is, and then you start beating the other person with the violin, being like, no, my one's right, and all that, and then no one's sitting around being like, how do we play the fucking things? Like how do we play the violin?
Somebody is copyrighting every melody. Like somebody just made a MIDI file of every melody. And they took that whole thing. It's like, I can't remember how many. It's ridiculous. It's on one hard drive, and it's a lawyer and a musician are copywriting one thing, and it's not to be in control of it. It's to say, hey, I shouldn't be able to do this. We need to fix these laws.
Yeah. There's a few things happening right now. One of the things we have happening right now is a Christian talks to Jordan Peterson thing, where one person is talking psychologically and one person is talking ontologically about Satan is a being that has identity and power and agency. That's the Pentecostal. The Jungian is saying, well, or Petersonian will say, let's just leave the metaphysics aside. Let's talk psychologically. So Satan is an archetype that we see manifest repeatedly in the history of humanity. We would do well to understand the archetype and therefore be able to manage ourselves in a world where this archetype continues to manifest itself among people in these various ways. Okay, I just want to name that here because if you do enough diving into Jordan Peterson conversations, you begin to realize these two groups can talk to each other, but it's helpful to understand what they're doing when they're talking to each other. I just want to lay that out.
There's story. We're both talking in story. It's just but they're parallel stories.
Yes,
but we're
parallel claims.
Yeah, parallel claims, but. With the story that I saw on that particular video, well, it was like two videos. It's where you were talking about, you said that your world was being torn in half, and that was really cool to watch because your excitement was palpable, Steafon. But
which video is this?
It's when you noticed that the names in the Old Testament and I think it was.
Oh yeah, I know that one. Yeah,
that one. The names are a sentence.
Yeah.
And so I was just like, oh, okay, cool. he's putting more weight into this, but with the story that you laid out with Satan. It was very Jungian in that it came around, and where you had talked about how there's like, okay, so where's the redemption story in this? And so you had said like at one point you'd bring Satan around to a way that you could forgive him, and I'm just like, have you read Revelation? That's not what happens to it.
Okay, like two more points I got to make before you two can meet on this. Okay, second point, a difference between antiquity and modernity, which Steafon is pointing to.
Yeah.
In antiquity, generally speaking, the goal of a virtuous person is to align themselves with the way things are.
Very interesting. All right. Yep.
Okay, that's what ancient people tried to do. Try to discern the cosmos and conform oneself to the cosmos. And if you do that, you will be in harmony with the cosmos. If you do not conform yourself to the cosmos, you will be in disharmony, friction, chaos. You will have all of this. That's the path of antiquity. The path of modernity is conform the cosmos to me, colonize nature, build cities, control the weather, take the world and shape it according to my instincts, desires, and my idea of the way the world should be. Okay? That's the modern mind. Now, right away, you can begin to see what I talked to you about before in terms of a perfect past followed by corruption and the desire to get back to perfection. If you look at that dynamic with respect to these two fundamental perspectives on reality, you can begin to understand why movements work as they work. Okay? So there's a second dichotomy between the vision of antiquity, which is conform myself to the way of the world so that I can be in harmony with all that is, and the modern perspective, which is conform the world to me and my vision. Okay, now you might see where we're getting towards the Satan, either archetype or person. Now, the third that I want to talk about is this idea of the metadivine realm versus God. And Kevin's probably listened to some of these videos, and Steafon hasn't. A Jewish scholar was trying to figure out why the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, was shaped the way it was. And he came to an understanding that there's a fundamental difference of perspective between what we might call paganism and what we might call the Abrahamic religions. And the perspective is this. In paganism, the universe is fundamentally impersonal. What that means is it just is, and there are powers in this universe, and it is our job to discern these powers in order to make our way in this universe. Now, you could make your way as, let's say, a monk, an ancient monk who wants to conform themselves to the way of the universe, or you could make your way as, let's say, Odysseus, who wants to do, striving and conniving and, just one way or another, try to game the universe and figure out how to make your way in it. But the universe is a thing, not a person. It doesn't have a will. The Abrahamic religions founded on the Old Testament all believe that at the center of the universe is God, and God is a personal God. Now, I don't want to call God a being, because once you call God a being, he's one of many beings. But that's what's fundamental in the universe. Now, the Satan archetype, what that means is that rebellion, because in this case, if the universe foundation, if God is the source of all being or the ground of all being, then rebellion is sin. Now, yes. Satan is the archetype of rebellion against the will of the universe, and the universe has a will. In the other metadivine realm, the universe has a structure to which gods and persons and spirits and angels and demons all must conform or not conform at their peril. Those two different paradigms will mean a lot in terms of how one approaches the universe. And so to understand Satan within Christendom is to understand that fundamentally in this type of universe, sin is rebellion. In this type of universe, in the universe of the metadivine realm, sin is nonconformity. Okay? It's not really rebellion. It's just, deciding to try and go your own way, but the universe never loses. So it's those two realms.
Because the Greeks would have hubris and nemesis. Hubris is arrogance, nemesis is divine. It's literally like poetic justice. It's like
exactly.
That's really well explained, Paul. That's really well explained. That's something I've been kind of jostling in my mind a bit, and you kind of pointed it out. You painted it very, 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 very well, and it just sparks something off that's a little bit dark, and it's kind of annoying because I literally have to go now, I'm afraid, so I can't stick on for it. But I guess I'll drop it in just for the sake of it, just for the jives. And I believe what Nietzsche was saying when he said the death of God, it was actually rooted in that idea that the Abrahamic thesis had a flaw in it, proposing what it proposed, considering the scientific understanding of the universe.
That's right.
And so as far as I understand, maybe move away from the Satan thing a little bit. As far as I understand, what he was suggesting is that the whole paradigm shift that happened, and the reason why we all are getting crazy now trying to create the utopia and murdering loads of people, is that like we're like literally burning out now in the end of that thesis, and starting to grind. You know, the joints are out of juice and it's starting to grind on bone at this point. And he was like, this was his really scary thought. Like, this is dark stuff, but he said that we will become educated in the falsity of that thesis through billions of deaths. That's pretty much what's going to happen. It's like the way we now look at communism with incredible suspicion. It like eventually a couple of those will happen. That's such a horrible thing to say. I hope it doesn't. But by the end of it, people will just have enough and they'll be like, right, wait a second, we have to be serious about this. That's actually, the way you described it there helped me kind of get what's going on. And I'm not sure what I believe about that. Because,
well, if you take the modernist ethos, that it's ours to colonize the universe, and the metadivine realm, that the universe can be colonized, you get Nietzsche.
Fuck. he's like the most dodgy of both.
Yeah. Because you combine those two. The ancients would say, you can't beat the universe. The modernists say, we make the universe, but it's impersonal. And so Nietzsche says, that's right. The new evolution is, we are the universe. We become the house. No more of this God of slavery, this God who cares about the weak. It's our job to own the house.
And so he's suggesting that thesis of there is a point to the universe is going to keep running in the background, driving us all to murder. And then at some point we have to just turn around and take control of it. And then obviously, if you look at that from a Christian lens, that's just literally like Satan talking. That's a pretty interesting challenge.
It takes it from the original mode of being for people on Earth was to be, we were supposed to be stewards. We were just supposed to cultivate the place.
Because the universe has a will.
It changed it from gardener to conqueror.
Yeah.
In Cain, building giant cities, and it's like, this is my land. It's like, okay. I thought it belonged to him.
Yeah. On that bombshell, gentlemen, Kevin, Paul, it was a pleasure to talk to you. That was great. And I'm afraid I have to go. I had something booked for about 7:15, so I'm going to be a bit late for it. But thank you very much for the time, and thank you very much, as always, for having me on and whatnot. And I assume you're going to talk a bit more afterwards, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm sorry I was late. I didn't know you'd rescheduled it that early.
It's no problem. We were just talking about different flavors of ice cream. Like it was nothing. It was great.
You can hear. We'll post it.
Yeah.
All right,
Paul,
Steafon.
Thank you very much, sir.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you later, Kev. Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh, dear. So what did I miss?
Well, he started talking. I didn't know what he wanted to talk about in terms of education. Now I've got a better idea of where he was going and what he's trying to sort through. And it was kind of fun to have a Pentecostal and a Jungian, because there's a way in which these two very different impulses meet. And I never would have imagined that until I saw Jordan Peterson at a place like Liberty University. Because you're right, they can, and I never would have imagined that without Jordan Peterson, because suddenly you have this Jungian who is agnostic about ontology, really exciting people who are all about the ontology. People who are living in the story versus people who are talking about story.
I told Job in our conversation, I said, in the middle of high school, I was around 16. I said, I think I believe this stuff. I told a friend of mine, that I'd said this in the last video we did, at the age of reason, that's when I started to believe, you know, when he had stopped believing at the age of reason. I was just like, I can't not believe. And it was a weird, it was a weird intersection. And even Job said, yeah, 16 is a strange place to start believing. And I said that the videos that Peterson had put out on the biblical series, I said, the more I listened to it, the stronger my faith got.
Yeah, yeah. I felt the same way.
Yeah.
Well, and here's the funny thing. Sounds terribly Calvinistic of me, but you probably never stopped believing, even though part of your mind thought you weren't believing anymore.
Mm. Yeah.
And it's that distance we have from ourselves sometimes. And so because I mean, here's the weirdness.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a Pentecostal and you're living within the story, you're living within the story. And but there's lots of stories that are going on at the same time. So you're living within the story, but you're in a modernist universe that says that's not just a story, that's a false story. You have to stop living in that story. And then you bump into things that make you wonder, is it the real story? Then you have, Jordan Peterson over here, who basically psychologically is saying, well, we don't know what to do with metaphysics or ontology, but we all do live within stories. And so, well, now here's the thing. If we're in the metadivine realm universe, and all there is, and it's impersonal, and unlike the theist universe where there's God, where resisting the story of the God is rebellion, well, in this universe, pretty much any story you want to live within that makes you happy, there's no God to judge you. You're just, and if you had the good fortune to be born and raised in your early years, formed within a story, you can very much live embedded happily within it. We're coming up into a time when more and more people in Western culture have not been raised within that story.
Mm-hmm.
It's harder to believe it if you haven't been embedded in it. It's not impossible, but all of that early childhood formation that maybe you rebelled against in your teens, you can slip right back into that. Let's say you didn't have any of that stuff. Now, in a way, you need the church more if you didn't have any of that, because you need to, in a sense, just like someone, let's say, who's trying to work their marriage when their parents had a terribly dysfunctional marriage, and all of their implicit assumptions that they don't really have conscious access to have been formed by this horrible marriage. Takes a lot of work to build a good marriage. Well, if you were formed in a healthy Christian household and you rebelled for 10 or 20 years, you can slip back into that programming because it's very deep within you. Mm-hmm. And in fact, all of those songs are, in a sense, deep within you. If you weren't raised with that, it's an uphill climb to start to deprogram and reprogram yourself when you're in your 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, instead of getting that programming in before you were 10. So that's why for a lot of people, they can slip back into it if they were raised in it. If you weren't raised in it very strongly, it's difficult to feel it. And what's really difficult is that if you're still embedded sort of in this impersonal universe, then it's doubly hard to feel, because you keep saying to yourself, it's only a story. It's only a story. It's only a made up story. I want to know the truth. I want to know the truth, because knowing the truth is critical for me navigating this impersonal realm and discerning the rules and so on and so forth. So,
well, the story analogy is very, it's very comforting, because the idea behind a story in modern, even in modern culture, is like, if it's a bad story, nobody's going to pay attention. And and as Christians, we trust God. It's just like, can you imagine the kind of story he can write? It's like, this is probably going to be great.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
So it's very encouraging to live inside of a story. But I had sent this in an old email a while back, as I was talking about the story, and what annoys people is when like, if you walked up to somebody in the street and said, hey, somebody else has written your life, they'd be like, no, I write my life. It's like, okay, let's see how that goes. But and you tell people, hey, I know the author. It's like, no, there's no author. It's like, oh, you're not allowed to talk to the author. It's like, well, I don't know. He could help you go through the story properly. You can get that good ending. People would want to read your story if you talk to the author and say, hey, what's my next page? The next chapter in my life is looking weird if I try to write it.
Well, and so you have theism.
Mm-hmm.
You have this, let's call it non-theism, or the metadivine realm, where the universe is impersonal. Mm-hmm. And then there's actually a third option, which is chaos, that the universe is just chaos. And so some Eastern religions sort of go more towards that. Now, you're exactly right. So again, you've got the two movements of the modern perspective, which is I make my own world, or the ancient perspective, which is live in conformity to the world. That's wisdom and virtue. So a modern person comes along and says, I write my own story. Okay. Tell me when you chose to be born. Tell me how you chose your parents. Tell me the genetic code that is going to determine, whether or not you have cancer, whether or not you develop schizophrenia, whether or not what. Tell me about all of the other things in your universe, coronavirus or nuclear holocaust or economic downturn, or you're writing your own story. Good luck. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, a Christian that says God writes my story. Now, there's some challenges in there, because but my mother died young, and I got sent to these crappy English boarding schools, and I got sent to World War I and gassed, and God's writing stories. Well, he sure brought a lot of crappy stuff into my story. What kind of a story is God? God writing in my life. I mean, there's the problem of evil right there. There's that stuff. But so then people are like, I write my own story. But then you're back to plan A. Oh, okay. How's that go? Mm-hmm. So in other words, the option is trust or not trust. So, okay, I'm not going to trust. Okay. Navigate. Guess what? Odds are I'll lay wagers that by age 110, you're dead and gone. I'll take that bet every time. Every now and then someone lives to 115. I punch it to 120. I win every time. I'll lay wager that there's going to be terrible things in your life. Someone's going to betray you. Someone's going to die. Someone's going to fire you. Someone's going to, you're going to have children. Oh, you've just put your happiness on, you're resting your happiness on their fortunes too. I mean, on and on and on and on and on. That's life in this world. So I thought about all this stuff a long time, and, you kind of think through the options like, okay, that's your option. These are the consequences of those choices.
Mm-hmm.
But again, a lot of it's built into us.
Who is that lady that you were talking? You did a blog post about her that she had written herself into the story.
Oh, that was Dorothy Sayers.
Dorothy Sayers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I poured over that.
She loved one of her characters.
Yeah, I poured over that, and I was like, man, I've noticed that in my writing, and like I have put myself in so many of my characters. I was just like, but one more than the rest, and I've put him through such horrible stuff. I mean, like the man, the introduction, the man's cheated on. Just like, dude, why would you do that to someone? Like a projection of yourself? Why would you do that to them? It's like, well, it's real, you know. If you, I mean, my gosh, I don't recommend this, but if you go onto the internet and you look up stories from people on chat rooms and their attempts at trying to do, wow, what's it called? Fan fiction. It's just power fantasies, and nothing bad ever happens to their character, or if something happens, it's very minor. It's like, no, dude, you read the Bible, God wrote himself into the story as the guy that went through the most suffering ever.
Yeah. Pretty insane, huh?
It's just like, yeah, if you're gonna write yourself into a story, something better happened to that person, or it's a bad story.
Yeah. Oh, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because imagine writing a story that, okay, well, I love Steafon's, writing yourself into the future and have nothing but ice cream stuffed in my face all the time.
Yeah, it's a bad story.
It's a bad story. And so it's fun because Peterson comes around and Peterson begins to assert, he says, here's the funny thing about us. Mm-hmm. So why is just getting your mouth stuffed full of ice cream a bad story? Mm-hmm. And why is it a good story that Bilbo is in his hobbit hole and there's no ever, and Gandalf and dwarves come a-knocking? Mm-hmm. Why is that a good story? And Peterson will say, well, actually, that's been built into us for a very long time. It's built into us that story is a good story, and we're attracted to that story. But that story doesn't just let us stay back and Bilbo, locks out the dwarves and Gandalf, and, something's built into us to in fact follow the dwarves. Mm-hmm. and face the ogres and face the dragon. And even though you're a small hobbit and, will get knocked out in the middle of the most important battle in the story, but yet you will have a pivotal role. And, so Peterson comes along and suddenly gives everybody a vision for, okay, maybe God is good. Mm-hmm. And maybe God is also not nice in the sense that a lot of people in churches have wanted to treat him as nice. So yeah, it's pretty wild.
I mean, my goodness.
You got to run? I don't know if you're.
No, that was just Dad. But
I was wondering if you're talking to yourself.
No, the last couple of times in church, I can't remember which psalm it is, but there's a psalm about about the story being written, and my pastor, he's been referencing that the last couple of times, and I'm like, why is he saying that? It's like, where's the link in that? And he's like, the story's written, And he said, if you listen to God, you know, you're gonna have a great story. I'm just like, but the story's already written. I'm just like, I'm like Arminian Calvin, Arminian Calvin, Arminian Calvin. We're Arminian, but it's just like, man, like it's Israel. You're wrestling the whole time.
Well, you know, and everybody makes a big deal about the Arminian Calvin thing, but here's the thing: if you think about it like time, when you're going through time, it's all looking like choice.
Yeah.
If you're above time, looking down at time as one thing, you know, and so, but then we want to jump out of time and look at it and say, ah, see, it's all caked. No, people can't do that. So, and the Bible doesn't want us to choose either or. It says from the foundations of the earth, from the perspective of God, one thing. From our perspective, another. We can't see from God's perspective. That's my take on it.
I think Dad found the psalm. Which one is it?
139:16.
139.
Oh, yeah.
16. Yeah. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they were written. They all were written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. Man.
Yeah. So you know, people make a big deal about that, and I just say we can't do those calculations, so forget about it. And I like Tim Keller's take on it. He said, if you believed everything was set, you'd never get up in the morning.
Yeah.
If you didn't believe everything was set, you wouldn't dare do anything, because you're going to mess everything up. And so there's this weird trick about we have to sort of take a both and approach to this question of determinism versus free will. I think it's fundamentally a matter of perspective, less than ontology. We as human beings have to live our life. We're responsible for our choices. There's no other way about it. Well, that's the way we go through life.
Peterson addressed it, and he said, I think it's both, but I think it's the closer you get to the choice, the more determined it is.
That could very well be too.
I was just like, wow, that's a way of thinking about it. You've got all of this. Here's option, and the closer you get to the choice, the option shrinks.
Yeah,
it's just like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Because it's both, and in the Bible, it's kind of both. You're like looking at this like, how can it be both? That doesn't make sense. This is like, well.
Well, there's just so much doesn't make sense. Why get hung up on that not making sense?
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. I mean, and what's so funny is that people are like, well, Calvinism. Well, did you ever read John Calvin? The guy preached like 5-6 days a week. I mean, why would he do all that preaching if he didn't think people weren't listening and having to make choices? Well, I'm sorry, I'm just telling you what your decisions are going to be. John Calvin didn't sound that way. So, you know.
Well, yeah, and I there's a book that I want to read. It's called Reconsidering Arminian, and like the guy dug into, like he was a part of the project to grab all of his great works and put them all in one tome or whatever, and he said there's a lot of misconceptions going on about how he and Calvin saw things, but it wasn't so black and white, and that's what's been so encouraging about watching your videos, is seeing all of these people from different sects all converging again on, and it's just like the differences don't really matter that much.
or different differences matter now. I mean, the differences that matter are always changing too. And so that's just normal in the world, you know. Nazi Germany comes up, suddenly everybody gives up their Pearl Harbor gets attacked and everybody gives up their isolationism overnight, or 90% of people. So, you know, it's how we are. We're just people. We're inconsistent. We're a mess. We're, you know, again, the most dominant biblical metaphor for us are sheep. You ever watch sheep? They're not that bright.
No.
They do stupid things. They get eaten a lot. That's right. They get eaten a lot.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Man.
Well, we should, you know, we'll see how Steafon chews on what we had a conversation with. And, you know, there's a lot to say about Satan in terms of even just the history within the Bible of the figure and what happens in the intertestamental period, and Jesus then. I mean, it's hard to argue against a literal Satan when you read the temptations of Jesus. So I prefer just to default to you know, just say, okay, this is what Jesus said, let's start there, because proving that there isn't one, well, you can't do that either. So, and it stands to reason, again, if you've got theism, and that the universe is personal and God has a will, then it's not unbelievable to imagine. And see, the other distinction that I didn't get a chance to talk to him about is that what happens in secular society is a rather presumptuous assumption that human beings are the only willful agents present in our midst.
Yeah. There's principalities.
well, and you can think about those principalities psychologically. You can think about those principalities sociologically. The Greeks certainly understood those principalities in terms of spiritual beings, but there's an assumption that human beings are the only agents, personal agents around. Now, that's why C.S. Lewis, for example, when he begins his book Miracles, begins with a ghost story, because if you go to the Del Coronado, if you Google Del Coronado hauntings, let's say, this is a very famous hotel in San Diego, you know, there's a lot of freaky stuff that happens there that nobody can explain. Jordan Peterson tells a ghost story that I talked to a colleague of Jordan's who shared the room with Jordan when all those drawers opened. Jordan tells that story on a podcast.
Yeah.
And
H3.
Yeah. And you know, according to the other person who was with Jordan, who doesn't believe in anything supernatural, he says, yeah, that happened. I said, how? He says, well, weird things happen. Oh, okay. But if you're just going to say weird things happen and also say there's no such thing as any other significant beings in our midst or realm, you can't really say both. One is just saying weird things happen. Okay, well, are these part of those weird things? No, they don't exist. How do you know? How could you know? And the thing is, you can't. And so obviously, almost all of human history, people have asserted that there are other significant agents in our midst even. Almost everyone has thought that, except for this tiny slice of, even today, the number of people that will say, that'll say it publicly and the number of people who believe it are two different numbers. Yeah. Because I regularly, as a pastor, will have people say to me things that are not politically correct, but I know they believe, and enough of those people tell me these things that, okay, these are what human beings believe. So what are you going to do with that? So, you know, there's plenty of reasons to be skeptical of certain secularisms that are rather dogmatic and dismissive of beings that cannot be quantified or tested. So my option is, why presume to know something I can't possibly not know? and where I have evidence that, well, lots of other people have believed them, lots of other people tell me stories, and these people don't seem to be of bad faith. I can't explain it, I can't know it, and so I say, okay, why should I be dismissive? So that's how I go there. And if there are in fact other significant agents who we might call spiritual, even though, you know, what kind of word is that? In rebellion against a personal God, why wouldn't there be a hierarchy amongst those beings? So to me, I don't see real reasons to not believe in the devil. And whether it's archetypal, I think that's true, and more ontological, as a Pentecostal would. I don't have any problem with that either, and I think that's true. Jesus certainly talks as if that's true. The New Testament certainly talks as if that's true. So lots of people dismiss it. So okay, dismiss it. Well, I'm not going to get bothered one way or another with someone on that score, but that's my take on it anyway.
Well,
So,
I was listening to your conversation with Guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you were talking about the spirit of a marriage. Yes. And that was a fascinating conversation, because it went along with what Peugeot had said of, it's just like, well, you know, there's a spirit in a crowd, there's a spirit in cities, like there's a spirit in a country. It's like, what do you think Uncle Sam is? You know, so
he said Santa Claus, I said Uncle Sam.
Oh, you said so.
I learned a ton from Jonathan on that, and that conversation I had with Jonathan, I learned a ton from him. I've learned a ton from Jonathan. He's really been super helpful.
Yeah, and so there's the idea. There's the ones that we conjure up. You know, Santa Claus. We kind of made that story. Have you read Glenn Beck's story on Santa Claus? It's weird. It's a weird retelling of the Santa Claus story, as he started out as a farmer of frankincense, and so it draws out the whole story of what happened to him and why he lived so long. It's really a trippy retelling. But shoot, I lost my train of thought. Oh, with those ones we've kind of conjured up. With like Uncle Sam, that was basically propaganda. But the idea of, hey, there's these beings that are over certain countries, you know, the Prince of Persia. It's just like, well, who's that? Well, you don't get a lot of information about him, right? But all you know is that he delayed somebody.
The crazy thing about Peterson is that this stuff mostly works both psychologically and ontologically. That's the thing. You can't tell the difference.
Yeah.
And so this one part of when the last conversation that Jonathan Peugeot had with John Vervaeke, Peugeot made the point, which I think was an excellent point, you know, whether it's that way all the way up and down, in terms of where we're at, you're not going to tell the difference. And then my conversation with John Vervaeke in terms of the proper posture of dealing with it, you know, on the up and down is in fact the spirit of finesse, in terms of we treat it as a person. That's why when our car breaks down, we swear at it. We cuss at our car.
Yeah.
And we talk to the universe. And we do, and again, people who've given up all kinds of ontological beliefs, they continue to act as if the car, you can hurt the car's feelings, or you can, you know, somehow argue the car into starting again.
Or hit the steering wheel.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, or whack the
What,
TV.
what are you hitting?
Yeah, exactly. It makes no sense, but it makes me feel better. Okay, but you're running some deep code in here. And in a sense, we might say, oh, that's bad code, we should throw it out. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't.
Yeah.
That's hard to know. And it is funny that in many cases, which again, this is the real contribution that Peterson made, whether you're sort of running the code psychologically or you're running it, at least for your part, ontologically, there's a lot of overlap. And that's interesting. So again, a Christian would say, well, maybe we were made to run the code this way. And we see intention in the universe. We see divine providence. But again, as I've said before, providence can be a emotionally costly doctrine to maintain. But again, the point you made about stories, we really like maintaining emotionally costly doctrines because that's what gives us meaning.
Yeah. It and with the written story, the suffering makes the story better, because there's a price and a reward, and the depth that you get in a painful story is much better than you would get out of a Hallmark card.
Yeah, that's right. Mere sentimentality, mere nostalgia. No, that's right. Well, we should sign off, Kevin.
Oh yeah.
But thank you for setting this up.
Oh my gosh, it was like herding cats.
Yeah. Well,
and I'm sorry I was late. I didn't know that it had rescheduled that soon. I thought it was at 7 his time, but it ended up being
6. And then that, you have you folks in Arizona don't do daylight savings time. So sometimes you're with us in California, sometimes you're not.
Well, and I did not sleep last night. I was absolutely suffering all night. I was basically laying there with my eyes closed, and I don't know how many hours of sleep I got. Might have been 2, might have been 3.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's miserable.
I've been suffering. So the timing on this, I was just like, wait a second, 11, 12, 11:30. What time is it going to be? So I checked my emails and there's the link. Oh no, I'm late. Pop in. The room's a mess. I'm a mess. I'm just like,
well,
well.
we'll see. We'll see what Steph thinks of what we gave him, and if he wants to continue, because I think
I hope he didn't take my pushback personally.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
He doesn't seem the kind of guy who's gonna be all, he talked to me to him.
Yeah.
Nah, it doesn't seem that way. All right, so I will post this probably either tomorrow or the next day or so. So we'll I think this was a good conversation though, and I think some people will have some fun with it.
Yeah, it'll all hammer out.
It will. Okay, Kevin. I hope you get some rest today.
Oh yes, thank you.
Okay.
I'll do that.
Okay. Bye-bye.